Can you use your Prusa MMU2 unit on any 3D printer that runs Marlin firmware? Maybe. The Prusa MMU2 is a multi-material unit that was designed for the Prusa Mark III, or the Mark III's. But because the people that develop Marlin and the Marlin community are so awesome, they quickly put the features for the MMU2 inside the Marlin firmware. So in Marlin 2.0, it is available to configure the MMU2 unit. But how hard is it to get that MMU2 set up on just any 3D printer? Well, surprisingly, in the current configuration, it wasn't that difficult. You just need a few extra pins on your main board. I am using the mini Rambo board, and it's a lot like the IDE, so it really wasn't an issue there. But you should be able to do it on a lot of different board configurations. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to walk through all the steps of getting the MMU2 set up on a Marlin-based 3D printer. Now this is the Ultimachine IDE board, the one that comes installed on the Mark III and the Mark III's. Now in this configuration I am using the Ultimachine Mini Rambo board, but the spare pins on both of these boards are almost exactly the same. And for the IDE and the Rambo, you don't have to alter the MMU2 cable at all. It'll be exactly the same. You're going to use this top row of pins right here. The brown wire on the cable will go on the inside. The blue wire on the cable will go on the outside. Remember, the top row. The second row is for the filament sensor, but we'll talk more about that in a second. You do have to alter the filament sensor cable for the IDE versus the Mini Rambo. There is one pin difference. If you want to use the filament sensor that comes off the Mark III on your Mini Rambo board, you would just have to move the white wire from this pin to this pin. Just one pin over, and that should get you working. And just for reference, when hooking this up to other boards, your VCC pin, your voltage in, will be right here. Your transmit pin will be right here next to that. Your receive pin will be right next to that. And by default, I'm pretty sure this pin, the one with the brown wire from the MMU2, is configured as a reset pin. And more than likely, you don't even have to configure this. You can set one up, you can pick a pin and configure it in the firmware, but I think for the most case, you can just run without it. And before we take a look at any more configuration items, I think it's important to note that the current Marlin 2.0 version doesn't accept any feedback from a filament sensor to the MMU2 unit, like the current Prusa firmware does. It works more like the original Prusa firmware, where you just kick out a length of filament and hope that it's long enough to get to your extruder gears. Now you do still have access to that secret MMU2 menu where you can adjust the length of the tube that feeds your extruder. I do have a video on how to do that. I'll leave a link to that up in the corner. But everything does still work. I am using the most current version of the MMU2 firmware, which is 1.0.5. And I'm sure with the current progression of Marlin 2.0 that those features will be available soon. But for now, let's take a look at a couple of different boards, and we'll get into the firmware to see how to get everything configured. What about everybody's favorite board, ramps? Well, you can just use the AUX1 pins like we do for a lot of things. Your 5-volt pin will be right there. Your transmit pin is right here, and your receive pin is right there. Again, you can probably hook up a reset wire if you would like, but I don't think it's necessary. If you do want to hook one up, you can use any of the pins in AUX2. You just have to define that pin in the firmware. What about the SKR 1.3 board? Again, we can just use the AUX1 pins. You'll have 5-volt right here, transmit right here, and receive right here. Same thing with the reset pin. You can set one up you like, use any of the extra pins you have. You could even assign it to one of the max in-stop pins if you really wanted to. The only caveat is to use the internal serial on a 32-bit board with Marlin, you have to enable it. And in 2.0, to enable that second serial interface, you do that right here by uncommenting this line. You just make this a 2 if you want. With 8-bit, we don't have to worry about this. We can just leave it commented out. So what about providing power to the MMU2? Well, I just ran the power wires from the MMU2 down to the control box, and I redid the connectors that are powering up the board. There are 2 of these on the Mini Rambo and on the IDE. The IDE has screw-down terminals, so they give you blade connectors to use with the MMU2. But on this one, I just redid the crimps, added those small gauge wires in there, and put it all back together. It works just fine. So you can make an adapter and get as creative as you want here, but you also do have lugs open on your PSU. You could just run the wires over there and use those, but you would have to open up your case and your PSU to get that configured. But any way that you can get 12 or 24 volts to your MMU2, it should work just fine. It does work at both voltages. It is a little noisier at 12 volt because of the stepper drivers. You have a little more whine, but it should work okay. And just to give you an idea of what we got going here on the MMU2 side, these are your power connections that we hooked up to 12 volt here, and these are your data connections. You got your blue 5 volt, your transmit and receive, green and white, and your brown wire here. So hardware-wise, that's pretty much all there is to it. You can hook it up just like any other serial device. But now we move to the firmware configuration. So for this config, we're going to use the Arduino IDE since we're on an 8-bit board. If you're using version 1.8.9 of the IDE, it will compile successfully, no issues. And I am assuming that your Marlin config is set up for your printer and working successfully. We're just going to add the MMU2 pieces. This is a brand new version of Marlin 2.0. I just downloaded it today. So we're going to start in the configuration.h tab. Let's just do a Control F for find, and we'll look for MMU2. The first thing you're going to come to is defining the MMU2. By default, it's commented out. So just remove these comments. You'll see up here that it has some requirements. You need to use the nozzle park feature, and we need to set it to 5 extruders. So that's 1 hot end, 5 extruders. And the park feature is going to be used if there's a problem with the MMU2. It will set it in a location where you can work on the MMU2 and then retry. So we'll scroll back up just a little bit, and you'll see extruders, and you want to set that to 5. And then we can Control F, and we'll find park, and we'll come to the nozzle park section. You want to uncomment this line, nozzle park feature, and then you want to set the location of where you like your nozzle to park. I like the nozzle in the front right corner of the printer, so it moves the bed all the way back and the head all the way to the right. So mine is set to X max position, -10, and Y minimum position, +10. So almost all the way right, almost all the way back. It's actually set to the back left corner by default. I like this much better, much easier to work on. You can also set the feed rates of when it parks X, Y, and Z. The defaults work fine for me. And that's all you need to change in configuration.h. Now we'll go to configuration_adv.h. So again, we'll search for MMU2, and here are the more advanced settings. So the first thing we come to is how it handles the serial interface. For the 8-bit boards, it's going to just default to the internal serial. It's available pretty much all the time. For 32-bit boards, I showed you before, you're going to have to select which alternate serial port to use for that communication to enable that transmit and receive pin. Since we're on an 8-bit board, this default configuration should be just fine. You can leave it internal serial and port 2. And right here is where you can manually select that reset pin, the one we're not really using. If you would like to use it, you can just pick which signal pin you'd like to use on the board and enter its number here, and it will be in effect. For this config, we shouldn't need it. And then we have the 12 volt stepper mode option. I did uncomment this line because we are running at 12 volt. I'm not sure exactly what this option changes, but I'm guessing it's something with the stepper drivers to make it a little more quiet running at 12 volts. Next up, what script would you like to use if the FindaProbe gets triggered, or it runs out of filament? By default, it's M600. That's your standard filament change script in Marlin. No need to change it. It works pretty good. It's going to go to that park location, kick out some filament for you. I'll show you more on that in a second. You can add the MMU2 menus if you like. I suggest you do it. Uncomment that. You can select how much filament is ejected when you do an eject filament on the menu. 80 millimeters is default. No issue with that. I leave that there. And then here are some interesting settings that you might have to adjust depending on what printer you're using. This is what defines the filament load sequence. This is what defines the filament ramming sequence when it unloads and tries to shape the tip of the filament so it'll work correctly with the MMU2. Basically, this is the number of millimeters that it's moving the filament forward or backwards. Backwards is a negative. And the feed rate it's doing it at. Now I have adjusted mine just a little bit for the first movement because I'm using the Mark III's extruder. It's a little shorter than the Mark III extruder. So I'm loading less filament on the initial slow sequence. I left everything else the same as it loads it to the tip of the hot end. And the ramming sequence I have left default for now because I haven't seen any issues with it. It's important to note that your printer needs to be set up pretty dead on as far as E-steps for the extruder goes, so definitely calibrate that, because if it's moving too quickly, you might end up with ramming issues or jamming when you're trying to load. And while we're on that subject, I did convert log over the Mark III's extruder body with the Bondtech gears. I'm calling this the Mark 2¼ It has the chimney for the filament sensor, even though I'm not currently using it. I wanted to add that in case I wanted to test it later. It has the slanted fan with the reworked duct. Again, I am using the Bondtech gears. I'm using an E-step setting of around 140. That seems to work pretty well. The top filament housing cover right here is also a little bit different. I'm using the one from Thingiverse, I'll link it in the description, that uses the 10mm coupler so you can feed the Bowden tube right in. Back to the firmware, this should be all you have to do to get the MMU2 section configured. You can turn on MMU2 debugging if you want. Just take this comment off, and it's going to kick out some extra stuff in the terminal to show you what's going on with the MMU2 if you're having issues. Let's just leave it off for now. And the last thing we need to tackle in the firmware is the advanced pause feature. So we need to scroll back up a bit. We can just search for advanced, and you'll need to remove the comment off of this line. This is what enables that M600 script, so it'll kick out the filament if there's any issues triggered by the Fenda probe. Depending on the printer style, if you're using a Bowden or something like that, you're going to want to tweak these settings to get the filament out correctly. The default settings do work pretty well for a direct drive extruder and for the Prusa configuration I've found, so I left them all default for now, but you might want to tweak these later. Again, you will need this for the M600 to work correctly. And when everything's ready to go, you can just upload it to your printer. Tools, select your board, select your COM port, and then hit upload. And if everything went correctly when you power on, you should hear your MMU2 boot up and start to calibrate. You can kind of hear that hiss of the stepper motors. It actually does get a lot better after the print starts. And now we need a file to print, so let's jump into Prusa Slicer. And we're just going to use this 5-color block as an example so we can get around to all the filaments and make sure everything's working correctly. But we do need to adjust our printer settings because we're not on an actual Prusa printer. So all I did was take the default MMU2 settings and I made a few changes. Now if you're not using a Prusa, you're going to have to adjust retraction length, whether you want Z-lift or not, alter it for your printer. Log is really close to a Prusa machine, so I didn't have to change a whole lot. So I just made my log MMU2 config. On the general section, I did change it over to riprap, because if you leave it at Marlin, it's going to enforce acceleration control for the Prusa, and log isn't quite that fast. I did change it to 5 extruders. I didn't make any changes to the extruder because again I am using the Mark IIIS extruder setup, so it doesn't change a whole lot for me, but you will have to make adjustments if you need to. In custom G-code I did change up a few things, because Prusa doesn't use the same commands as Marlin does for a lot of different stuff. All this top portion, down to the homing, can stay the same. Even if Marlin doesn't like these commands, it won't hurt anything. You will need to change your G80 to a G29 if you're using auto leveling, which I did. You can leave this G21, again, not going to hurt anything. In this section, Prusa is using an M403 to tell each extruder what type of filament you have, because they adjust different settings if you're using that type of filament. Marlin's probably not going to know what this is. I left it in there just to keep the configs as much the same as possible, but you can take it out if you like. I don't think it's going to affect anything. I left the single extruder multi-material printing if statement in here, and I did change the prime line that Prusa uses. I changed mine to Y0, so after it's done with the G29, it's going to be in the back right corner. It's going to come straight to the front of the bed, still in the right corner, and start that prime line. It'll move Z down to 0.2. I did change that up a bit. It's going to select the initial tool load. This is default. So whichever extruder you start with, it's going to move the MMU2 over there after it does the calibration. Then it'll do an X55 move as a prime line, a 5mm, then another 55. Then it's going to move Z up a bit, come back across and do some more priming because it moves from one side to the other and back to make sure all the filament is changed out correctly. Change this one to Y.2 because I had the other one changed to 0, so it's going to move a little bit back and do that other line. Again, back to X55 for more priming. And then an M221, not sure Marlin understands that one, but in the Prusa firmware, that's to keep it from crashing on the top if it's already at that level. And then G92E0 to reset the steps back to 0. And the NG code can pretty much stay the same. It's about unloading the filament and getting it away from the wipe tower. This should work as expected, whether it's on a Prusa or not. So this rough config should get us going printing multi-material. So we can go ahead and save it, go back to the platter. Just make sure on this model, I'll link it in the description, that you're using all 5 different filaments. We can slice, export it to our SD card, and now we're ready to start printing multi-material. Just to give you a look at that MMU2 menu we enabled, You can load the nozzle, eject, all the same stuff you can do in the regular MMU2 menus. But we'll go down to print from SD, and we'll print our MMU2 file. Now, I probably shouldn't have to say this, but if you're using your MMU2 anywhere, don't set your filament up like this. I just grabbed a handful of MakerBox samples to try this out, to get this configuration to work. But if you're using this for long term, this is going to hang up and cause all kinds of issues. So try out some auto winding spools or your own creative spool setup, but definitely don't do this for very long. Back to the video. And after the heating is done, it's going to move the hot end up to the Y front position. And it's going to go through the MMU2 calibration. And in our case, it's going to go to extruder 1 and pull in the filament. It's going to load it down to the hot end. Once it's at the hot end, it's going to start our priming. It'll move it all the way to 0 on X, start kicking out our prime line, and it's going to head over and start making our prime tower. Well, the first layer is looking good. Let's see what the next couple layers look like. We're on the 4th layer, and we're getting ready for our first filament change. Let's see how this goes. It unloaded successfully. It's loading number 2. The load looks successful. It's starting to print a new color. I can't believe it, but it worked first time. Well, so far I'm impressed. Let's see it get through a couple other changes. The purge tower is missing a few lines when it does transitions. I probably need to lengthen my load time just a little bit. Just make one of those load parameters in the firmware a little bit longer. That should help. Well, there you go. We've been through all 5 color changes. No issues. We're headed back to filament 1. Let's let it run a little while and we'll check it in a bit. We're about a third of the way through the print and I haven't had any load failures yet. I actually can't believe that it's working so well so far. But let's see how far we get. We're halfway there, still no issues. I'm starting to get a little nervous. We're at the 75% mark. The purge block's looking a little messy, but the print is looking great. 0 intervention, no misloads whatsoever. Did that print seriously complete without any misloads? It's true, over 5 hours of print time, 200 tool changes, and not one single intervention. Again, the white tower's a little messed up, but the print quality looks great. I find it kind of hard to believe, but this thing just worked. It almost seems like it should have been harder than this, or I missed a step or two. But it was just a couple of wires and firmware tweaks, and it worked almost straight away. You can see the results. Granted, my printer is a lot like a Prusa printer already, but from what I've seen, you can make a lot of different 3D printers work with the MMU2 with just a couple of tweaks or 3D printed parts. You just have to focus on the loading and unloading of the filament on the extruder. It has to be as easy as possible. A big thanks to everyone that worked in Marlin to develop this feature. It's very impressive. And I guess the MMU2 isn't just for Prusa firmware anymore. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.